The Youth Criminal Justice Act is the law that applies to those between the ages of 12 to 17 who have been accused of committing a criminal offense. It outlines that young people must be treated differently than adults because they lack the maturity to understand what is right and what is wrong. At the same time, the Youth Criminal Justice Act points out that young people must be held accountable through interventions that are fair in proportion to the seriousness of the offense they commit. Most of the time, when a teenager commits a crime, their identity is protected by a lifetime publication ban. They can also apply to have their record expunged. But what does the court do when a young person's crime is so horrendous that rehabilitation and intervention for the young offender is a lost cause? The senseless killing of Kimberly Proctor was one of those cases that shocked the community of Langford, British Columbia, and the details surrounding the murder were even more horrifying. On March 18, 2010, Kimberly was lured into a home in Langford, British Columbia, where she was forcibly confined, tortured, and killed by 2 teenage boys. They then mutilated her remains, set them on fire, and disposed of them underneath a nearby bridge. This is the story of the murder of Kimberly Proctor. So we begin today's story in Langford, British Columbia, located at the south end of Vancouver Island. It's a town that's on the smaller side, with a population of 40,000 people, but it's one of the fastest growing communities in British Columbia. Back in 2010, 18-year-old Kimberly Patricia Proctor lived in Langford with her father Fred, her mother Lucia, and her brother Rob. Her father would describe her as a homebody, who loved spending time listening to music and playing on her computer. Kimberly was close with her family. Her aunt would later say that she was a bright and bubbly teenager who almost skipped into the room when she entered. For high school, she attended Pacific Secondary School, which was a small grade 10 to 12 school with about 200 students. She was known as somebody who adored animals and had raised dozens of them, including floppy-eared bunnies and her dog Miko. She also had cats that lived with her grandmother because her father was allergic. Her friends saw her as a problem solver and a peacemaker. And when speaking of his daughter, Fred Proctor would say that she was a great kid with a big heart who was gentle to a fault. Kim's best friend Melissa said that Kim was rambunctious and talkative, and that she had a good sense of humor and liked to have a good time. The two loved watching scary movies together and spending time at the mall. When investigating her case, Darren Legan of the RCMP said that Kimberly was a typical teenage girl who may have been doing some things her parents were not aware of, but wasn't known to the police. She was into goth culture and had a profile on the online forum vampirefreaks.com. On this site, Kimberly would write about being bullied her whole life, and for being different, and that she was afraid of teenage girls. She also wrote about disliking bitchy preppy girls, bullies, guys who are total jerks, and anybody who's mean. On the afternoon of Thursday, March 18th, Kimberly's mother called home to check up on her daughter, but nobody answered the phone. Lucia Proctor would then call her daughter's cell phone, but it was turned off and immediately went to voicemail. This was an instant red flag that something was wrong. According to Kimberly's mother, her daughter always kept her cell phone on and used it frequently. She also didn't have a history of running away from home, and it was unlike her to go somewhere without telling someone where she was going first. But that evening, when Kimberly failed to show up for a scheduled babysitting job, her mother immediately called the police and reported her as missing. Over the weekend, friends and family handed out missing persons posters around the town of Langford, with hopes that Kimberly was still alive. And a Facebook group set up to bring awareness about her disappearance grew to over 4,500 people. But then on the evening of Friday, March 19, 2010, less than 36 hours after Kimberly was reported missing, human remains were discovered beneath the Galloping Goose trail in Colwood, which was just south of Langford.
Good evening. Thanks for being here. The brutal murder of a woman on Greater Victoria's West Shore remains unsolved tonight, but RCMP are going over dozens of new leads in the case. Tips came in over the weekend after the victim's burned body was found Friday night in Colwood, not far from the Galloping Goose Trail. An autopsy on the remains has now been done, but the victim has not yet been identified. And the friends and family of a young woman who was last seen on Thursday night are praying that the murder victim is not her.
Police still don't know the name of the woman whose body was badly burned beneath this bridge on the Galloping Goose Trail, but investigators are getting some good information. The body was found Friday night. Yesterday, police searched Millstream Creek below. Police say media coverage of the case over the weekend and a public plea for information has provided them with key details. An autopsy was conducted in Vancouver today, but the woman has not yet been identified. RCMP don't know who she is, but they have spoken to the families of several missing women, including the family of 18-year-old Kimberly Proctor. The Langford teen hasn't been seen since last week.
This trail was a former rail line and was popular with both cyclists and runners. Police would only say that the remains belonged to a woman and that she died as a result of homicide, but wouldn't say much more, other than whoever was responsible attempted to burn the body. Police also wouldn't say if they were searching for a murder weapon or the age of the victim. Although, the day after the body was discovered, RCMP divers searched the Millstream Creek under the Galloping Goose Trail, searching for additional possible evidence. During media interviews, police stressed that the person or persons responsible were still on the loose, and they wanted everyone to be aware of their surroundings and to report any suspicious activity in the area. Women were cautioned not to go anywhere on the Galloping Goose Trail by themselves until the suspect or suspects were caught. Complicating the investigation was that the area underneath the bridge was a popular hangout place for teenagers on the weekend. Kids would gather there to drink and party, which is why loud noises or shouting wouldn't seem unusual to residents who live in the area. Some residents who lived nearby reported hearing screaming and smelling a strange odor near where the body was discovered. But at the time, they didn't think this was strange. Because the remains were burned, figuring out who she was more difficult for investigators. There was nothing else found at the scene that would help with identification. The media already suspected that the remains belonged to Kimberly Proctor, but Darren Langan of the RCMP stressed that they were analyzing 29 missing person cases from the Vancouver area, including Kimberly's, to try to identify the body. But the next day, police would publicly confirm what everyone already knew in their hearts, that the charred remains belonged to Kimberly. She was positively identified through a DNA sample taken from one of her hairbrushes.
We don't have an answer to the very basic question of whether what happened to Kimberly was targeted or whether it was random. And we need to answer that question, but we're still in the process of assessing and analyzing all the information that we have to answer that question, and we haven't been able to do that yet. So until we are, the public need to increase their level of awareness and caution when it comes to their personal safety. It is one of the key answers that we're looking for, and as soon as we're able to inform the public more accurately about what we know as to whether this was random or targeted, we'll certainly do that. We understand the level of concern that's in the community, especially with parents, because Kimberly was an 18-year-old young woman who came from, from all accounts, a very solid, loving family, and could have been anyone's daughter. And I think that we understand that. We have children as well, and we live in the community also. So we're very conscious of the effect it's having on the community, and we are looking to answer those questions as quickly as we can.
Police wasted no time retracing the teenager's last steps before she disappeared. More than 40 investigators were working the case. The investigative team included local RCMP and officers from integrated units on Vancouver Island and the Vancouver area. The last time Kimberly was seen alive was the morning of Thursday, March 18th, when a bus driver spotted Kim leaving a BC Transit bus at the Station Avenue bus interchange in Langford. She was wearing a black hoodie with the number 13 in red on the front and pink, blue, and green Converse high-top shoes. 36 hours later, her body would be discovered under a bridge near the Galloping Goose hiking trail, and police had no idea how she ended up there. It would also be revealed later that when Kimberly's body was recovered from the scene, a plastic bag was found covering her head, and her neck had a noticeable injury from an attempted strangulation. Police always suspected that where Kimberly's body was discovered was not the murder scene, that she was killed elsewhere and the killer or killers drove to the Galloping Goose trail to dispose of her body. But throughout the investigation, police were very close-lipped about what information was released to the media. They wouldn't say if Kimberly knew her killer or killers, or if this was a random attack. They would only say that the investigation was proceeding, and they were satisfied with the progress. Police would examine Kimberly's school life. They interviewed her friends, and spoke with any new recent acquaintances. There were rumors that Kimberly may have started a new relationship. Investigators also combed through her social media activity on Facebook, MSN, and text messages. Her Facebook page included a post dated March 6th about a relationship she recently ended with an unnamed boyfriend. In this post, she said she had to break up with him because he turned out to be a psycho with really bad anger issues. One friend who was interviewed by police said she was concerned about a new guy that Kimberly had been seeing. She apparently wasn't dating him, but talked about him a lot to this friend. Although this friend couldn't tell police how old this guy was, or what school he went to, or couldn't say how they met. And another friend would tell police that Kimberly had met a guy who wouldn't give her space. But none of Kimberly's friends ever imagined that something like this would happen to her, and couldn't think of anyone who would want her dead. Although she had been bullied in the past, there was no indication that this was a motive for her murder. Almost immediately after Kimberly was identified as the murder victim, the RCMP was flooded with tips. Everyone was eager to help solve the case, perhaps a little too eager. For the first few weeks after the murder, police had to deal with many online posts and rumors that turned out to be fake. Social media was still fairly new in 2010, and police had to sort through a ton of posts and determine what was true or just speculation. There was a Facebook memorial site for Kimberly with over 2,500 members, and this became the center of the online rumor mill. It was here that one person claimed that one of Kimberly's boyfriends sent her a text message threatening to kill her if she ever broke up with him. And another person claimed that they last saw Kimberly around 1 p.m. on Thursday, which was contradictory to the information police currently had. Police were actually forced to issue a press release to address the multiple rumors. There was also the added frustration of people within Kimberly's social circle holding back information from the police. The police would say that the information is going to come out, and it's best to come from them. Investigators would say that social media was a useful investigative tool, but it was also impeding their investigation because every tip, even if they were just rumors, needed to be investigated. The sheer volume of information and how quickly it was received made things challenging for the police. 2 months after Kimberly was murdered, the RCMP announced that Kimberly likely knew her killers, and this was not a random crime. This announcement was most likely made to ease the anxiety within the community. Police would only say they had identified a number of suspects, but wouldn't say how many exactly and wouldn't identify them. During this time, the media quietly announced that a search warrant had been executed at a house on Happy Valley Road where a woman lived with her teenage son. Police would tell reporters that they expected to be at the house for several days, and they were mainly interested in objects in the house, not the residents. Things would quiet down for about a month, and then, exactly 3 months after Kimberly's charred remains were discovered underneath the bridge at the edge of Millstream Creek, 17-year-old Kruse Wellwood and 18-year-old Cameron Moffat were arrested and charged with first-degree murder, sexual assault, forcible confinement, and indignity to human remains.
Our team of over 40 officers, complemented by 60 additional officers from specialized units, has worked night and day, leaving no investigative lead unchecked and gathering every piece of available evidence in hopes of identifying and apprehending those responsible for Kimberly's murder. Last night, those efforts led our team to arrest 2 Langford teens for Kimberly's premeditated murder. The males, aged 16 and 18 years old, remain in our custody and will appear before justice this afternoon.
And since both of the accused were under 18 at the time of the murder, their identities were protected under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, at least at this point in the story. That same day, the Crown Attorney, Peter Duke, announced that he intended to seek adult sentences for the accused if they were convicted. According to provisions in the Youth Criminal Justice Act, the teens would be tried as youths. But because the charges were serious, if they were convicted, they could be sentenced to adult prison time. The day of the arrests were emotional for both Kimberly's friends and family and the police. RCMP investigators and additional officers from other forces had logged over 20,000 hours trying to determine who was responsible. Darren Legan, the spokesperson for the Island District RCMP, would say that the murder was the worst he had ever seen in the 10 years he'd been on the force. And while some investigators would continue to work on the case, Legan told the media that he didn't expect there would be any further arrests. Very little was publicly known about the 2 accused teenage boys in the beginning, because their identity was protected by a court-ordered publication ban. Fortunately, that ban has long ago been lifted, but I'll get to that later. Suspect number 1 was 16-year-old Kruse Wellwood. He was an only child, and his mother and father separated when he was just 18 months old. Throughout his teenage years, Kruse was defiant, argumentative, verbally, and sometimes physically abusive. At the time of his arrest, Kruse was living with his mother in Langford. I don't usually believe in the theory of the bad seed, but in Kruse's case, he sadly lives up to his family's legacy. His father, Robert Raymond Deswan, had a criminal history that was eerily similar to his own. Robert was also in prison, serving a life sentence for second-degree murder. In 2001, he sexually assaulted and strangled 16-year-old Cherish Oppenheim and attempted to hide her body in the woods of Merritt, British Columbia, under a pile of leaves and rocks. Robert would later take the RCMP to where he buried Cherish's body, after pleading guilty to her murder.
He's down here somewhere.
How far down?
I don't know.
Here? You want to have a look? Yeah.
Oh God, no.
And if that wasn't bad enough, Deswan did this while he was on bail for the previous sexual assault of a woman in Kelowna. He was also convicted in 1993 of unlawful confinement and break and enter after he broke into a home in the middle of the night and tried to stuff a rag into the homeowner's mouth. So although Kruse had no relationship with his father, the two were exactly alike. On his public Facebook profile, Kruse referred to himself as a nihilistic atheist. Kruse was described by a friend as someone who was much smarter than the average student, but wasn't very enthusiastic about school. The second suspect, Cameron Moffat, had 2 older half-brothers and a younger sister. His parents separated when he was 9 years old, and he was apparently affected by his father's absence. Cameron had anger issues, was difficult to manage as a child, and engaged in destructive behavior at an early age. The evidence against both of the accused would be overwhelming. So much so that they didn't even attempt to fight it. Just 4 months after they were arrested, both boys would plead guilty to Kimberly's murder, as well as indignity to a dead body. The day they pled guilty, the BC Supreme Courtroom was packed, and the first row of seats were blocked off by the sheriff for security reasons. During the proceedings, the accused made no eye contact with Kimberly's friends and family, as they stood and said they were guilty of the charges. A 5-page agreed statement of facts was read into evidence, outlining their relationship with Kimberly and their plans to murder her. Kruse and Cameron had been scheming back and forth on MSN and text messages for a while. Kruse appeared to be the mastermind, although he would later point the finger at Cameron and say that he just went along with things. Kimberly knew both of her killers through school. She had previously dated a friend of Kruse Wellwood during the summer and fall of 2009. During this time, she and Kruse became friends, and they would talk on MSN and text. Sometimes their messages were flirtatious. When Kimberly and her boyfriend broke up, Kruse would ask her out. She initially accepted, but then turned him down by text message. From May to November of 2009, Cameron also spoke with Kim on MSN. Again, their chats could get flirtatious, but eventually Kim would also turn him down. Around November of 2009, Kimberly reached out to Kruse and asked him why he and Cameron were picking on her. He responded with, quote, "If I was picking on you, you would have torn yourself apart." He then told her not to message him because he had more important people to talk to. According to online chats with another female friend, Kruse Wellwood offered two motives for the murder. The first motive was that Kimberly was apparently an easy target, and the second motive was that he had been dreaming about killing someone since he was young. On March 16th, 2 days before Kimberly went missing, Kruse would send a text message to a female friend asking, "What would your opinion be on me if I killed, raped, or brutalized someone?" The evening of March 17th, Kruse sent Kimberly a text message telling her he wanted to meet her in person the next day and explain why he and Cameron had been mean to her lately. She agreed and planned to meet up with them at 10 a.m. the next day. Kim and Kruse then had a long phone conversation that ended in the early morning hours of March 18th. But she had no idea that Cameron had been listening in on the conversation the entire time. She also had no idea that Cameron and Kruse had been communicating for the past few weeks online. There were hundreds of text messages sent back and forth, where they discussed where and when they would meet, the specific brand of fuel they would use to burn the body, how to get back to Kruse's house, whether they should take the bus or walk, what buses they should take, and what they would say or do to carry out the attack, including the use of code words to initiate things, and a discussion of various possible sites of where they could dispose of her body, including making references to a detailed map they created for this purpose. On the morning of March 18th, the two met Kimberly at the bus exchange. Cameron then went to the store to buy fuel, and then the three went back to Kruse's house, arriving just after 11 a.m. The boys attacked Kimberly by grabbing her around the neck and binding her hands and ankles with duct tape. She was also gagged with a sock, and over several hours, they repeatedly assaulted her, both sexually and physically. She was choked and suffocated and eventually died. A knife was then used to mutilate her body. After Cameron and Kruse killed her, they placed her body in a freezer in the garage of Kruse's house. And if all of this wasn't horrible enough, what if I told you they tried to do the same thing again, only a few hours later? That very same night, over the course of 3 hours, Cameron sent text messages to another girl he went to high school with, and tried to convince her to sneak out of the house and join him at Kruse's place. He sent these text messages while Kimberly's body was inside the garage, stuffed inside the freezer. Fortunately, this girl would turn Cameron down. The next morning, Kruse and Cameron would put Kimberly's body and the fuel into a large duffel bag. They boarded a bus and went to the bridge beneath the Galloping Goose trail, where her body was doused with fuel and set on fire. Investigators would later recover fabric, zippers, and grommets consistent with a duffel bag at the scene. Later that morning, Cameron went to brunch with his mother, and Kruse spent the day with his girlfriend at his house, as if nothing had ever happened. About a week after Kimberly was murdered, Kruse confessed to the same girl he had texted with 2 days before Kimberly went missing, and said that he had killed Kim. The girl knew that he was talking about Kimberly Proctor, because he also sent her links to news articles about her death and said that it was her. Kruse apparently told this girl everything, all the graphic and horrifying details, And when this girl asked if he had pre-planned it, Kruse said yes. And he also told this girl that he thought he would get away with it and didn't feel bad about it. And weirdly enough, Cameron would also send messages to this same girl about the murder, and told this friend that he was aware that he and Kruse were going to target Kimberly, telling her that it was Kruse's idea, that he was the one that approached him and asked if he wanted to do it. And when this girl asked Cameron if he felt bad about it, Cameron would only say that he felt bad about getting caught, and that he didn't feel bad about Kimberly's friends and family. Also entered into evidence was a 35-minute wiretap intercept of Kruse and Cameron as they were driving in the sheriff's van to their first court appearance. Here, they made fun of the interrogators and the polygraph examiner and joked about escaping.
I had a million escape plans last night.
Huh?
I had a million escape plans last night.
A which?
A million escape plans, but...
It's hard to escape from this.
Well, all of them would have been temporary solutions.
Yeah. I knew they were coming for me before they got there.
I heard you were texting your mom.
Mine?
Yeah.
Your mom texted me, like, arresting Kruse, and I'm in the car with Athena going to a baseball game. I'm like, do I get out of the car and run away, or do I sit here?
I just left St. Vincent de Paul. I was just, like, walking right past the Starbucks, and I thought I heard someone call my name. I, like, looked around, and someone called my name again, and they were like, drop the bear. Because I had a bear from Mary.
Oh, drop the bear. It's gonna be like Stewie. You're gonna pull off its head and have like some kind of gun in there.
They were really trying to stroke my ego, tell me how smart they think I am, and oh, you're so good at manipulating and things like that.
Really? They just made it seem like I got screwed over, and they're like, we understand. And I'm like, you tell me
The entire time, I had this expression.
On the way back to youth detention, Wellwood made light of being asked by investigators if he had any remorse.
They're like, remorse. Do you feel any remorse? Any regrets? Anything inside of you? Any remorse? Regrets? Any remorse? Any remorse? Remorse? Is you remorse?
The two didn't appear to be nervous at all. They seemed to be more preoccupied with their shoes and how their greasy hair looked. They also complained about cold showers and bad prison food. Kruse did tell Cameron, though, that he knew Cameron had been speaking with investigators and told him to stop talking and exercise his right to remain silent. Wiretap conversations between Kruse and his mother were also played for the court, who would tell him that she didn't feel safe with him in the house.
I'm relying very heavily on you, and you've been failing me every single time.
Yeah, well, I fail you every time, don't I?
Well, apparently, that's why I'm here, right?
Don't lay this on me, buddy.
In the end, both Cameron and Kruse would turn on each other, with each blaming the other for plotting Kimberly's murder. While incarcerated waiting for trial, Kruse told a psychologist that he took part in the murder only out of loyalty to his friend. Kruse also had issues keeping his mouth shut after the murder and told multiple friends about the crime. Cameron, on the other hand, didn't tell anyone about what happened to Kimberly, other than the police.
The biggest adrenaline rush you ever have, because it's, what the fuck?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't imagine. I've had adrenaline rushes, but I can imagine that this is a huge adrenaline dump, eh?
Not in the good way either, like when you're doing something like physical and it's intense,
yeah.
Adrenaline, it's like, oh, that's such a, good rush.
Yeah.
I love doing that, and this is just like the adrenaline where it's like, oh my freaking god, you want to puke your guts out. And
fight or flight. Have you ever experienced that before?
Yeah.
So this is probably the biggest event of fight or flight in your whole life?
Probably. I was in and out of the room, like, a lot.
Okay. Alright. Still the one on that adrenaline rush there, eh?
Don't want anything to do with it, but I don't want to to freak him out because, like, what the fuck?
Yeah. Oh no, that's understandable.
He's not running, but he's, strutting around the house, like, yelling to himself. It's like,
kinds of things.
This just happened. What happens if I don't listen?
Right. Yeah.
So it's the fight or flight thing is like, listen and maybe I'll get, through this and nothing will come of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what's going through your head at that time.
It's self-preservation.
So what do you do?
I left the room. I went and sat in the living room. Just the TV was on and just sitting there wholeheartedly trying to forget what's happening and watching the TV. Just watching the TV, nothing else. Not thinking, not talking. I can't even say I was breathing. I was just watching the TV with all my concentration.
Okay.
But according to the Crown prosecutor, both of them were at fault, as each of them were very significantly implicated, no matter what version of the story was accepted. And the online chats, just hours before the murder, suggested that both knew exactly what was going to happen. 8 court-ordered psychological reports for both of the accused were submitted into evidence, showing that there was little to no chance that either one of them could be rehabilitated. These reports urged Justice Robert Johnson to impose an adult sentence for both Kruse and Cameron to protect the public. In these reports, Kruse was described as intellectually bright and curious. He didn't really get along with others and had a superior attitude towards his peers. And he also felt contempt for his mother, who he physically hit on 2 occasions. Kruse confessed to the psychiatrist in his interview that he wanted to experience the act of killing and was diagnosed as a deviant sexual sadist with strong psychopathic traits and had strong indicators for necrophilia. Another report described Kruse as polite, charming, grandiose, superficial, and suspicious, and it was recommended to the court that he'd be followed closely until his 40s, as he was a high risk to reoffend for the next 25 to 30 years. And another psychiatrist would say that Kruse showed an extreme degree of narcissism, with no remorse and a complete disregard for his victim. And a juvenile forensic psychiatrist believed that Kruse's risk to reoffend might be reduced after the age of 50, but rehabilitation was unrealistic, telling the court, quote, "Unfortunately, we do not have any treatment to deal with the degree of psychopathy." Cameron's future, on the other hand, was a little more uncertain because after his arrest, he attempted to minimize his involvement in the murder, and also lied repeatedly to the psychiatrists who interviewed him. The court was told that Cameron was a difficult child, hard to discipline, and rebellious for most of his life. He began setting fires at the age of 13, and he had previously been arrested in February of 2006 for threatening his mother with a knife. And when asked why he went along with the murder plot, Cameron would only say that Kruse was nuts and he didn't want to piss him off. He said that he was remorseful, but the psychological report says otherwise. Although Cameron wasn't diagnosed as a sexual sadist, he was found to have sexual deviancy tendencies, which put him at a high risk to reoffend. He was also described in the report as aggressive, threatening, and intimidating. And the court was told in general terms that people with those tendencies were at a high risk to reoffend with a sexually motivated homicide. The psychological report recommended that he'd be followed closely for the rest of his life. The prosecutor also reminded the court that 3 days before Kimberly was murdered, Cameron searched the internet for information on bone fracture in the inside parts of women's bodies. One psychiatrist even compared Kruse and Cameron to the infamous child killer Clifford Olson, saying they were exactly the same. The only difference was they got caught earlier. Otherwise, they would be just as dangerous and prolific. Although Kruse and Cameron had entered guilty pleas, the friends and family of Kimberly Proctor had to wait an additional 8 weeks before finding out what their sentence would be. If the judge sentenced them as youths, the maximum sentence they could receive was 10 years, with only 6 years in custody and the remaining 4 years under conditional supervision. Their identity would also be protected by a lifetime publication ban, at least in Canada. However, if they were to be sentenced as adults, they would receive a mandatory life sentence, with the possibility of parole after 10 years, and the publication ban on their identity would be lifted. Given that I haven't been going out of my way to hide their identity throughout this story, you can pretty much guess how things ended. Justice Robert Johnson concluded that both teenagers were full and active participants in the murder, and sentenced Kruse Wellwood and Cameron Moffat as adults, and said that a youth sentence wasn't sufficient to hold the teens accountable for the crime, and imposed the maximum sentence allowed for young offenders, life with the possibility of parole after 10 years. The judge also lifted the publication ban protecting their identities since they were arrested. Quote, "It goes without saying that first-degree murder with the intent to kill is the most serious of offenses. The circumstances of this murder, as admitted by the young persons, are so horrific that no words can adequately convey the inhumane cruelty these young men showed Miss Proctor." Outside of the court, Kim's parents gave their statements to reporters, and they didn't hold back, calling both of the assailants monsters.
The sentence that was imposed today is the maximum sentence that can be imposed on a young person under Canadian law. With individuals of this psychological profile, there's no guarantee that they will ever be released from custody.
The investigation into Kimberly's death took its toll on the most seasoned RCMP officers.
A difficult file, one that our investigators will carry emotionally for the rest of their lives. But for us, certainly satisfaction today would be a good way to describe it. We had 10 of the investigators in the courtroom today. They take a very personal ownership of this.
Psychological and psychiatric reports read during the sentencing hearing explained how both teens had troubled home lives and began acting out early on. The report said both teens displayed strong traits of psychopathy. Proctor's mother says the boys' parents failed to raise good children.
As a mom, you see the signs. You know when your child is, something's wrong with your child when they're just rolling over in the crib. And to see what these two have been like and to totally ignore it, well, you know, as a parent, you failed.
Tonight, the Proctor family would like their daughter to be remembered as the kind and caring person she was, with a spice for life and a love of animals.
You know, she talked about being a counselor and when she finished school, or working with wild or domestic animals. We don't know.
We'll never know now.
We live every day, day to day right now. We don't plan anything. There's so many signs, the weather, the daffodils coming up. I mean, every day we walk past, down the hallways, upstairs and downstairs, past all of our kids' pictures that from the time they were babies right up to the time a year ago. There's constant reminders every day. It's just, I don't know how to, I can't say how we can move forward at this point.
Kim's father would say that they got the best decision based on the laws we have, but these two were prime examples on why we need capital punishment in this country. Quote, "To say you're going to give them treatment and rehabilitate them over the next 10 years and they could get parole is ridiculous. Why waste any more of our resources? They should be put under and put down. And preferably to me, it should be a long, slow, painful ending for both of them." Considering all the warnings Corrections Canada were given in advance about these two culprits, the people in charge are clearly not doing their jobs. In 2014, Cameron Moffat was transferred from maximum to medium security, less than 3 years after starting his life sentence. Corrections Canada, of course, had no comment, saying that privacy rules prevented them from discussing the transfer of inmates. How convenient. 10 years can go by quickly, though, and the first opportunity he had, Kruse Wellwood jumped at the chance to apply for day parole in 2019. But fortunately, he was denied both temporary escorted absences and day parole. The board acknowledged that Wellwood completed a high-intensity sex offender program in 2018, but a psychological assessment completed that year noted that Wellwood was cool, detached, confident, arrogant, superior, and entitled. According to the parole board, he scored a 96% on the psychopathy scale, although Kruse had the nerve to tell the parole board that he was neither a psychopath or a sexual sadist. Throughout this hearing, Kruse was told that he lacked empathy. He refused to take responsibility and blamed the brutal crimes he committed on his dysfunctional childhood, video games, and online pornography. To say that Kim's family was angry about the parole hearing was an understatement. In an interview with the Vancouver Sun, Fred Proctor would be quoted as saying, "Why we had to come here after really only 8 years since sentencing and 9 years since the crime was committed, the premeditated rape and murder of our daughter is just ridiculous." As ridiculous as this was, Kruse had enough moxie to apply for full parole in 2020, which of course he was denied, and apply for day parole again in 2022, and was denied again. The parole board would tell him that his reintegration potential was low, and that there was no community strategy presented that could meet his high-risk needs, or mitigate his ongoing high risk. And during his most recent psychological assessment, Wellwood was tuned out. He sat there with his shoulders slumped over, he wouldn't make eye contact with anyone, and he called the murder of Kimberly Proctor the event. He didn't even refer to her by name. The psychologist concluded that not only was Kruse's risk too great for day parole, but his risk was too high for a transfer to a minimum security prison. But Kruse, of course, didn't see things this way, and appealed the parole board's 2022 decision on a number of grounds. In Kruse's world, it's always someone else's fault and never his own. This appeal, of course, wouldn't go anywhere and was rejected by the parole board's appeal division. According to Canadian law, Kruse is entitled to apply for parole, although the way things are going, it's doubtful he'll ever be approved. I say this, but one never knows what the Parole Board of Canada will decide. I never thought Paul Bernardo would be transferred to a medium security prison, and yet here we are. The Proctor family is determined to keep Kruse and Cameron locked up indefinitely, and they feel betrayed by the system for subjecting the families of victims to annual parole hearings. In a 2019 interview, Kim's father stated that their situation was made worse because of the fact that there were 2 killers, and at this point, only one of them has applied for parole. Because of this, the Proctor family could be spending many years attending parole hearings. He also said that if Canadians knew the horrific details of Kimberly's murder, they would demand tougher sentences. Quote, "The coroner found that Kim had been raped. Her genitals were mutilated, underwear was stuffed in her mouth and taped shut. She was bound and thrown in a deep freezer still alive, and eventually succumbed to asphyxiation. However horrific the details, they should be broadcasted loudly, so that perhaps the bleeding hearts of this country can be silenced and the actual victims of crime can be heard." Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to hang out with me today. If you enjoyed learning about this case, please be sure to like and subscribe. If there's a case you would like me to cover in a future video, let me know in the comments section down below. To support my channel, you can go to Buy Me a Coffee if you would like to donate. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.